for thousands of years. I mean, literally thousands. Half the planet has completely misunderstood, like the most famous escape story in human history.
Right. The parting of the sea, the magic wands, the panicked flight from Egypt.
Exactly. But what if, none of it was actually magic?
Well, that is exactly what we are looking at today. We are doing a deep dive into a single ancient Arabic verse 26.52 to be precise, and realizing it really isn't a fairy tale at all.
Not even close. It's actually a highly sophisticated, like operationally precise manual for taking down a corrupt institution.
Yeah, and we're basing this deep dive on the foundational work of the thinker Ghulam Muhammad Parvez, specifically his Tolu Islam Lecture 517. He frames this whole narrative not as theology, but through the lens of systems engineering and sociology.
Which is such a wild paradigm shift when you first hear it.
Yeah.
So let's look at the verse itself.
Right, so the verse reads, وَيَيْنَ إِلَى مُوسَى أَنْ أَسْرِ بِعِبَادِي إِنَّهُ مُتَّبَعٌ. And the conventional translation that most people are familiar with tells us, travel by night with my servants, they will be pursued.
And for centuries, theologians and storytellers have basically framed this as the frantic, terrifying opening scene of an underdog's miraculous rescue.
Right, like they're fleeing in absolute terror. But Parvez argues that if we analyze the text structurally, we are looking at a calculated strategic withdrawal from an unreformable system.
Yeah, the word asri is really the anchor here, right? It means travel by night.
Exactly, and the traditional reading assumes they're sneaking away in the dark because they are just terrified and weak.
Right, like hiding from the big bad army.
But ASRI operates as a very specific operational directive. I mean, moving at night, especially in the context of ancient logistics, requires extreme coordination.
Oh, absolutely. Try moving thousands of people in the dark without modern comms. It implies moving under the radar, adopting the posture of a reforming community that has basically reached a mathematical conclusion.
Which is that staying inside a system that actively filters out all corrective signals is just a losing battle.
Right. They aren't fleeing in defeat. They are executing a blueprint.
And that strategic choice to move under the cover of night strips away the whole performative aspect of rebellion. A disorganized, panicked crowd cannot execute a night march across hostile terrain.
No way. It would be pure chaos.
Exactly. It requires supply lines, silent communication, absolute discipline. So this directive indicates a community that is transitioning from attempting to reform a corrupt state from within to establishing an entirely new civilizational model on the outside.
Which makes this incredibly relevant to, anyone listening right now who has ever tried to change a toxic culture.
Oh, for sure.
Whether that is a corporate monolith or a broken bureaucratic institution or even just a local government, you bring the data, you point out the inefficiency.
You prove that the current model is totally unsustainable.
Right. And then you realize the system isn't failing because of a lack of information. It's actually functioning exactly as intended to protect the interests at the top.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. So we are exploring the exact threshold where internal reform becomes mathematically impossible and building an alternative becomes the only rational choice.
But to understand how a text detailing the mechanics of civilizational survival, morphed into a story about wizards and magic tricks, we have to examine the linguistics of power.
The degradation of language over time.
Right, and that requires looking at the historical shift. Parvez argues extensively that the original robust Arabic language of the Quran, it's called the Lisani movement, the clear operational language, was systematically watered down over centuries.
And the Abbasid Empire plays a massive, massive role in that degradation, doesn't it?
Huge. If we look at the historical timeline, the early centuries of Islam were characterized by rapid, pragmatic state building. The language of the text was interpreted as a practical guide for organizing society.
Like managing economics, establishing law, survival stuff.
Yes, but as the Islamic center of power shifted to Baghdad under the Abbasids, the empire absorbed massive amounts of Persian bureaucratic culture and Hellenistic philosophy.
And the Abbasid court was a completely different environment from the harsh, survival-driven realities of the early Arab nomads.
Oh, completely. You had this entrenched, incredibly wealthy elite ruling over a vast, disparate population.
So if you're an absolute monarchy, a religious text that serves as a practical manual for overthrowing corrupt, extractive regimes is highly dangerous.
It's basically a threat to national security.
Right. So the interpretation of the text literally had to be neutralized.
And that neutralization happened through a gradual linguistic shift toward mystification. State-sponsored scholars began reading historical and sociological metaphors as literal supernatural events.
Because if Moses overthrowing Pharaoh is a story about a brilliant socioeconomic reformer outmaneuvering an extractive dictator, then the Abbasid peasants might, get ideas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if Moses is just a guy with a magic wand who relies on direct supernatural intervention to suspend the laws of physics.
Well, the peasants can't replicate that.
Right. They just have to wait for a miracle. Mystifying the text essentially pacifies the population.
That reframing is so essential to grasp. It completely changes how we translate the foundational symbols of the Moses narrative, starting with, the two most famous props, the stick and the snake.
Yeah, let's look at the etymology of the Arabic word Asa, which the Abbasid-era translations reduce to a wooden staff or a wizard's wand.
It's a piece of wood.
Right. But in the lexicon of ancient pre-Islamic Arabia, words evolved directly from physical survival mechanisms. The root concept of Asa actually involves the physical action of bringing the fingers together to form a tight, unified grip.
A grip. Okay, so how does that connect to a stick?
Well, in the context of nomadic desert life, gripping the tent peg or holding the center pole of the dwelling was the physical locus of community survival.
Because the harshness of the Hijaz desert meant that scattered resources or divided people literally died.
Exactly. Survival required literal physical consolidation.
And then early Arabic poets and orators expanded those physical survival mechanics into political metaphors.
It's a seamless transition from the physical to the conceptual. From a grip that gathers disparate things together, Asa evolved to mean centralization, power, support, and the consolidation of a community.
So it represents the concept of taking scattered elements and unifying them into a singular force.
Yes. So when the directive tells Moses to throw down his Asa in Pharaoh's court, he isn't tossing a piece of hickory onto the marble floor.
He's not doing a magic trick.
No. In the language of statecraft, the staff represents a centralized system of power, a unified constitution.
A code of law.
Exactly. It is the organizing principle of a rational society.
And we evaluate that constitution by looking at its adversary, right? Pharaoh's system also wields immense centralized power, but it is an exploitative, tyrannical system.
And in the socioeconomic poetry of the Arabic language, such a system is described as a thuban, a venomous snake or a dragon.
An entity that devours.
Precisely. It consumes the resources, the labor, and the dignity of the people without producing anything of its own. Pharaoh's economy is a pure extractive machine.
So the scene in the court suddenly transforms from, a magical duel into a clash of socioeconomic systems.
That's the paradigm shift. Moses is introducing a superior, rational, and unifying system, what Karwes refers to as kalimatullah, the divine law, or a flawless constitution.
And the text states that Moses' system logically swallows or dismantles the deceptive, exploitative policies of the pharaonic establishment.
Right. The rational constitution renders the extractive economy completely obsolete by exposing its structural flaws.
Wait, okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
If this was just a rational socioeconomic debate, why did ancient people preserve it as a story of literal magic for thousands of years? Doesn't the myth version serve a deeply ingrained sociological purpose, too?
It absolutely does.
Because human psychology leans toward the supernatural, because it inspires awe and cements communal identity in a way that, constitutional theory usually doesn't.
That's a very fair point.
Yeah.
Human psychology certainly craves the spectacular, and myth-making is a powerful tool for social cohesion.
Right. It binds people together.
When a community looks back at a civilizational triumph centuries later, the nuances of socioeconomic reform are often flattened into mythological shorthand. The awe inspired by a massive societal upheaval like the sudden collapse of a seemingly invincible empire feels magical to the generations that inherit the story.
Because they weren't there for the paperwork and the strategy meetings.
Exactly. But while the myth serves the purpose of communal identity, it strips the original event of its operational utility.
Oh, that makes sense.
If we want to learn how to survive and build systems, we have to bypass the later myth-making and return to the contemporary mechanics of the event.
And the contemporary mechanics point directly to how autocratic states control their populations. Because the text explicitly mentions the presence of magicians in Pharaoh's court, the Sur.
And if we are applying the sociological lens, these aren't illusionists pulling rabbits out of hats.
Not at all.
The linguistic root of Sur means deception, illusion, and the masking of reality to make the false appear true.
So the magicians were basically the state's intellectuals, the economists, the propagandists, and the spin doctors.
Exactly. Their job was to create and maintain the illusion that Pharaoh's extractive economy was the only viable reality. They masked the inherent exploitation of the system.
They were the institutional PR department manufacturing consent.
That is exactly what they were doing.
So the confrontation in the court, which is often termed a munazara, is actually a high-stakes public ideological debate. It's a clash of evidence.
Yes, Moses brings a rational, equitable blueprint for society, and the state's intellectuals bring their best propaganda, the snakes of deception.
And the text notes that Moses' argument was structurally flawless. It exposed the deception so comprehensively that the intellectuals, the seer, actually surrendered to the logic.
Right, the text states they fell in prostration. They converted to Moses' paradigm.
Which is huge, because a group of highly educated, comfortable state propagandists do not risk execution by an absolute monarch because a rural shepherd performed a neat optical illusion.
No, they don't. They crossed the aisle because they were presented with a viable alternative socioeconomic reality that completely shattered the intellectual framework they were paid to uphold.
They saw the math, and the math was undeniable.
Exactly. And the nature of that alternative reality is encapsulated in the narrative's second major symbol, the Yadi,
Which is traditionally translated as the white hand.
Yes.
And the standard cinematic depiction has Moses, putting his hand into his cloak and pulling it out, glowing like a halogen bulb.
Right, the special effects version.
But stripping away the visual effects, what is the actual operational mechanism of the radiant hand?
Well, if the Essa is the structural constitution of the new society, the Yadi is the operational administration of that society.
Okay, structural versus operational.
Right. In the linguistic context of the era, white or radiant represents an unblemished, transparent system of power. It signifies power wielded without the darkness of corruption or hidden agendas.
A completely transparent administration.
Yes. And the text pairs the radiant hand with a crucial qualifier, Gary Sue.
What does that translate to?
It translates to without disease or without flaw. And applied to a socio-economic model, a system without disease is an economy entirely free of exploitation.
Wow.
It is a system where no one's labor is siphoned off to artificially enrich an elite class. There are no dark corners, no opaque bureaucratic mechanisms designed to hide theft.
It's radiant because every transaction, every law, and every exercise of power is entirely visible and accountable. And the source notes provide a really fascinating historical parallel for this linguistic usage. There is a verified historical tradition where the Prophet Muhammad described the ethical framework he was establishing as a tilabaiza.
A radiant or white system.
Right, a radiant system where the day and the night are equal.
And the metaphor of equal day and night implies absolute structural equity. There are no shadows for the powerful to hide in, and no double standards. The law applies with the same transparent force to the marginalized as it does to the wealthy.
So putting the entire confrontation into its proper context, Moses walked into the epicenter of the most powerful tyrannical empire on earth.
Yeah.
He didn't offer parlor tricks. He presented a consolidated, unified constitution, the staff, that systematically exposed the state's extractive economy, the snake.
Right.
Furthermore, he demonstrated that this constitution would be operated by a completely transparent, uncorrupted administration, the radiant hand guaranteeing economic equity and functioning entirely without the disease of exploitation.
It represents a complete systemic threat to Pharaoh's existence. The pharaonic model simply cannot coexist with a transparent alternative.
Because transparency kills corruption.
Every single time.
Which brings us to the hinge point of the narrative, the core focus of verse 26.52.
This is where everything shifts.
Right, because Moses does everything right according to the rules of internal reform. He engages the system, he presents the data, he wins the debate.
The state's own intellectual class evaluates the evidence and rules in his favor.
Exactly. By all conventional logic, this is the moment the institution pivots and adopts the new model. The pilot program succeeded.
But the institution does not pivot. Pharaoh responds with massive escalation, violence, and suppression.
Which exposes the ultimate fallacy of attempting to reform an entrenched autocracy from the inside. The system reveals its true nature.
Yes. Pharaoh's administration is not lacking evidence. It is structurally incapable of processing evidence that threatens its power.
Because the feedback mechanisms of the society, like the courts, the advisors, the economy, are entirely captured by vested interests.
Parwez calls it the tyranny of unproven assertions. The pharaonic state does not need to prove Moses wrong. It merely needs to exert brute force to maintain the status quo.
It's like arguing with a brick wall that can also arrest you.
Exactly.
Hmm.
When a system reaches a threshold where its primary function is no longer to evaluate reality, but simply to suppress corrective signals, internal reform becomes mathematically impossible.
If the machine's core programming is designed to delete your code the moment you input it, typing faster won't change the outcome.
That is a perfect way to put it. And this is the precise moment the command in verse 26.52 is issued, travel by night with my servants, the directive to exit.
Right.
But it is vital to frame this correctly. The exit is not the abandonment of the reforming project. It is the project's necessary next phase.
Because operating inside an unreformable system forces a binary choice, doesn't it? You either become complicit in the extraction or you are crushed by the suppression.
There is no third option inside that system.
You cannot practically demonstrate a rational, equitable social order while residing inside a machine engineered to exploit.
No, you can't. The only way to prove the alternative works is to take the blueprint, extract yourself from the hostile environment, and build the infrastructure independently.
It requires a transition from petitioning for change to manifesting change.
Yes, but manifesting a new civilizational model requires resources and human capital. This is where the specific wording of the verse becomes critical. By body, travel by night, with my servants.
And the conventional reading of servants or worshipers conjures an image of like a passive, meek flock of religious devotees blindly following a charismatic figurehead.
Right, just a helpless crowd. But that imagery strips the event of its entire socioeconomic reality.
How so?
In this context, according to Parwiz's structural reading, the term ibadi refers specifically to those who have committed to the rational order as their primary authority. These were not monastic ascetics. The Israelite community in Egypt constituted the productive population. They were the engineers, the laborers, the masons, the architects, and the agricultural workers who physically constructed, maintained, and operated Egypt's infrastructure.
Wow. They were the engine of the pharaonic economy.
They were the entire workforce.
So the directive is not to gather the religious devotees. It is a command to mobilize the talent.
Yes.
Take the people who actually produce value, who have intellectually recognized the superiority of the new constitutional framework, and pull them out of the extractive system.
The exit is a collective, organized withdrawal of the entire productive community. It is the ancient equivalent of a mass general strike combined with a permanent exodus.
That is amazing. Think about the mechanics of a massive corporate entity today.
Okay, let's use that analogy.
Imagine a tech monopoly run by an erratic, tyrannical executive board. The corporate culture is toxic, the business model relies on extracting user data without consent, but the company dominates the market because they employ the most brilliant software engineers and systems architects in the world.
Right.
The internal feedback channels are completely blocked. HR doesn't care, the board doesn't care. So the top engineers quietly design a decentralized, ethical alternative platform.
They build the blueprint.
Exactly. Then, in a highly coordinated move, the entire engineering and creative departments resign on the same day. They walk out the door, taking the productive capacity of the company with them.
And that parallel perfectly highlights the structural dynamics at play here.
Yeah.
It leads directly into the predictive warning at the end of the verse. Innahum mudabon, they will be pursued.
Which the traditional reading treats as just dramatic tension, a warning that the evil army is coming to get them.
Right, but in systems engineering, this is not dramatic tension. It is a mathematical structural prediction.
Because of the resource strain.
Yes. The pharaonic system does not pursue the Israelites out of bruised ego or pure malice, though those psychological drivers certainly exist. The system pursues them because it structurally must. An extractive economy produces absolutely nothing on its own. Its survival relies entirely on siphoning value from the productive class.
Going back to the corporate analogy, if all the engineers walk out, the executive board doesn't send fleets of corporate lawyers after them just for revenge.
No, they do it out of survival.
Right. The executives pursue them because without that technical talent, the company's servers will crash in a week and the stock will go to zero. Pursuit is a symptom of the system's absolute dependency.
The resource base of the empire has evaporated overnight. The pursuit is an inevitability, a calculated factor in the strategic withdrawal.
So they knew it was coming.
Oh, absolutely. The reforming community is not ambushed by Pharaoh's army. They anticipated the response because they understand the mechanical dependency of the system they are dismantling.
Which sets the stage for the physical climax of the exit, the shoreline.
Right, the famous crossing.
The traditional narrative paints a picture of a trapped, panicking crowd staring at an impassable ocean until a magical staff suspends the laws of physics and create a dry highway through towering walls of water.
A very spectacular visual, but entirely divorced from the text when read through the lens of natural law and strategic intellect.
So what's actually happening at the shoreline?
The actual mechanism at play here is the law of requital in Arabic, mukafati amal. This is the foundational principle that actions generate inevitable natural consequences.
Okay,
Yeah.
so how does that apply to the pursuing army?
Well, the pharaonic system, having built its entire architecture on extracting value rather than producing it, is already in terminal collapse the moment the workforce crosses the city limits.
Right, they're bleeding out.
Yes. What is chasing the Israelites across the desert is not a highly functional, proud military force.
Yeah.
It is an institution in an existential panic, desperately trying to reacquire its lost human capital.
And this panic basically blinds them to environmental realities.
Exactly.
So how did the Israelites cross the water without supernatural intervention? I mean, it's still a body of water.
We have to examine the linguistic and historical reality of the crossing point. The Quran specifically mentions the Israelites finding a dry path, Terakun Yavasan.
Okay.
It does not describe water hovering midair contrary to gravity. It describes a path that is physically dry. And to understand how a path through a sea becomes dry, we have to look at the geographical topology and the meteorological data of the region.
Because the historical consensus places this crossing in the region of the Sea of Reeds, right? The shallow northern estuaries of the Gulf of Suez.
Yes, and the topology of the Sea of Reeds is characterized by specific tidal behaviors and meteorological phenomena, specifically wind set-down.
Wind set-down.
Yes. This occurs when sustained high-velocity winds push the water of a shallow estuary out into the deeper basin, essentially exposing the mudflats and submerged land bridges.
Oh, wow.
Combined with a receding low tide, the ebb-massive tracts of land become temporarily passable.
So the text reveals a masterful utilization of natural law, not a suspension of it.
Exactly. Moses, leveraging a deep strategic intellect and a superior understanding of the local environment, coordinates the night march to arrive at the basin during this precise environmental window.
They understood the natural rhythms of the environment far better than the centralized, insulated empire did.
Because the empire is too arrogant to study the natural world. They just want to control it. The reforming community, moving with discipline, crosses the Terakun Yavasan while the water has receded.
It is oceanography and applied science. It requires calculating wind patterns, tidal charts, and the logistics of moving a massive population across a temporary land bridge.
And the final operation of the law of requital plays out with mathematical precision.
What happens when the army gets there?
The pursuing army, operating entirely on arrogance, desperation, and blind panic, arrives at the shoreline. They see the Israelites crossing and, without analyzing the environmental conditions, drive their heavy, narrow-wheeled chariots directly into the tidal basin.
Just blind rage driving them in.
Yes, they are a system that defies natural law, attempting to operate within a highly volatile natural environment. And the clock runs out.
The wind set down ends.
Yes, the prevailing winds shift. The high tide returns. The flow rushes back into the shallow basin with immense hydrostatic force.
And the chariots.
The narrow chariot wheels bog down in the returning mud, rendering their military technology completely useless. The reforming community successfully weaponized the Earth's natural laws against an unnatural extractive system.
That is just incredible. The system's own failure to calculate reality, driven by its greedy dependency on the productive class, is what ultimately drowns it.
That's the core of the law of requital. And the historical and geographic consensus fully supports this natural tidal phenomenon. Modern scholarship has largely moved away from the wall of water myth, finding that the ancient linguistic texts align perfectly with the ecological realities of the Sea of Reeds.
So the magical embellishments were added by later generations.
Exactly. Generations who lost touch with the precise, harsh realities of survival and preferred the comfort of supernatural intervention.
Which brings us back to the central thesis of the text. For centuries, verse 26.52 has been read as a story about waiting for a miracle to save us from an insurmountable enemy.
But when properly understood, the verse offers a highly rational blueprint for systemic change. The directive to travel by night with my servants proves that the ultimate victory over a toxic, unreformable system does not require fighting a bloody, unwinnable war on the system's own terms.
Right. And it also doesn't require staying and submitting to extraction.
Exactly. The victory lies in peacefully extracting your value. You organize the productive energy, the intellect, and the labor, and you surgically remove it from the extractive machine.
And once the resource base is gone, the system's own structural flaws, its absolute dependency and its panicked arrogance, trigger its inevitable collapse.
You allow the law of requital to run its course. But, the utility of this knowledge depends entirely on application.
Right. Theory versus practice.
The ultimate survival tool is the ability to recognize the threshold. One must develop the analytical clarity to differentiate between an argument you cannot win because the institution's feedback mechanisms are captured and rigged to suppress evidence.
And the argument you must have.
Yes, which consists of demonstrating a superior model by actively building it outside the confines of the old architecture.
We've spent a lot of time today analyzing ancient empires and historical logistics, but the underlying mechanisms of power and extraction haven't changed.
Not fundamentally, no.
Look at the institutions governing our lives right now. Evaluate the macroeconomic systems we participate in, the digital platforms that monetize our attention and data, and the corporate structures where we deploy our labor.
We really need to examine them through this structural lens.
Mm-hmm.
Are they functioning as radiant engines of equity? Are they transparent systems without disease where the rules apply equally to all participants?
Or are they pharaonic structures? Are they opaque, extractive machines entirely dependent on siphoning your time, your intellectual property, and your labor to enrich an insulated elite?
It's a critical evaluation everyone has to make.
Exactly. And if you find yourself operating inside an unreformable, extractive system, ask yourself the most dangerous question of all. What would happen to that system if the productive population simply decided to coordinate, quietly extract their value, and travel by night?